I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I heard it. This place should have been torn down years ago. Her voice cut through our quiet cul-de-sac like a siren. I tightened my grip on my father's old mug, feeling the chipped handle dig into my fingers. The black SUV had just rolled to a stop at the end of the street. And out stepped the ghost we all thought we'd buried. Linda Carver, former HOA president, fresh out of prison. And somehow still convinced this neighborhood belonged to her. I sat on my front porch, under the same American flag I'd folded with my dad before he passed, and watched her stare at my old cottage like it was a personal insult carved out of cedar. She had no idea what she was walking into. The sun was just clearing the tree line, turning the lake behind the houses silver. Linda stood there in her stiff blazer, ankle monitor blinking quietly at her boot. Jaw locked, like the last 3 years hadn't happened, her gaze locked onto my place. That small, weathered cedar house at the edge of Cedar Ridge Estates, the one she'd tried everything short of arson to get rid of. She moved toward me like she was marching, back onto a battlefield she thought she still commanded. Her shoulders were tight, chin stuck so high you'd think she still had a board behind her. I didn't move. I just took another slow sip from that old mug, breathed in the steam, and let her come. "Mercer," she barked, pointing past me at my cottage. That structure was supposed to be condemned. I had the reports, the inspections, the whole process lined up. Her eyes twitched too fast, pupils a little too bright. Body wound up like a spring that never got unwound in lockup. I glanced at the brass plaque by my front steps. The one bolted into the cedar, registered historic structure, protected by state and federal law. "Morning to you too, Linda," I said. "You're standing awful close to my property line for someone with a blinking shackle on her ankle." Right on cue. The monitor on her leg chirped, loud enough that Mrs. Patterson's curtains across the street fluttered. A couple of neighbors stepped onto their driveways, phones already in their hands. Linda ignored the noise like she'd trained.
Taught herself not to hear anything that disagreed with her reality.
"You should have been thrown out a long time ago," she snapped. "This neighborhood was supposed to be orderly, uniform. We worked hard to keep out eyesores like that shack." It's a funny thing, I thought, looking past her at the mix of gardens, porches, and kids' bikes scattered across canted driveways. It had never looked more alive. Before I could answer, a sheriff's cruiser rolled around the bend, gravel crunching under the tires. 2 blocks away, the monitoring unit had been sitting, waiting for what every sane person knew was coming. "Step back from the property," Deputy Collins called as he climbed out, hand resting on his radio. "You know the terms of your release?" "You're not supposed to be here." Linda spun toward him, eyes wide, then wider, like she'd just now remembered she wasn't queen anymore. "This is harassment," she shouted, voice cracking. He set this up. Her cheeks flushed dark, breaths coming too fast. The same woman who'd once measured people's grass with a ruler was now kicking mulch as the deputy guided her away from my gate. The beeping on her ankle went from impatient to furious. Within minutes, a plain sedan pulled up. Her parole officer stepped out, face tired in a way that said, "I knew this was coming." "Papers ready." Neighbors lingered, trading looks that mixed fear, relief, and something like satisfaction. After years of being stalked with clipboards and cameras, they were watching the storm finally turn on itself. Linda ended up face down against the hood, wrists cuffed, still yelling about conspiracies and standards in her neighborhood. I just sat on the porch steps with my coffee, watching. 3 years I'd waited for that sound of doors slamming and engines rolling away. The thing about people like Linda is, they don't just vanish because a judge says so. Before she ever went to prison, she'd turned Cedar Ridge into something that felt less like a neighborhood and more like a small, badly run country with her as the dictator. Tape measures in the dark. Tickets for trash cans 5 minutes late. Fines for picking the wrong shade of white for mailbox posts. The only thing she could never bend was my house. My place had been here since before the subdivision. before there even was a Cedar Ridge Estates. The old cedar walls, the stone steps, the barn out back that still smelled like my grandfather's tobacco and machine oil. The developers had been forced to preserve it as a landmark when they built around the lake, so when she'd first shown up years earlier, flanked by 2 board members like she was walking into a zoning raid, she'd waved those violation notices under my nose. "This is a homeowners association. Mr. Mercer, we have standards," she'd said. "Your little relic doesn't get a free pass." I'd pointed to the plaque then, too. Let her read the line that said local rules didn't touch this place. Her smile had snapped off her face so fast, I almost heard it. That was the day she decided I was enemy number 1. From there, things got creative. Early morning inspections. Citations for grass 1/4 inch too tall. Letters claiming my porch light was non-conforming. And when that nonsense didn't work, she'd started showing up at night, crouched in my shrubs with a camera. Taking pictures like my mailbox was a crime scene. I'd stand at the window with my father's old flag folded in my hand sometimes, watching her crouch on my lawn like a raccoon that thought it owned the trash can. What she never realized was I'd mounted cameras of my own. Not just the big obvious ones, but little black domes under the eaves. Tucked in the old oak, pointed at the sidewalk. She thought she was gathering ammunition. She was building me an archive. The night she spray-painted unsafe order to vacate across my front door at 3 a.m, barefoot, hair wild, muttering about non-compliance, every second landed in crystal-clear HD. By sunrise, the paint was still drying when the deputies pulled up. She'd actually stayed, trying to photograph her own vandalism. Like she was documenting a crime she hadn't realized she'd committed herself. That was the beginning of the end. Trespassing, harassment, false reports, vandalism, filing bogus documents. The charges stacked like unpaid HOA fines. Court made it official. 3 years in orange. Cedar Ridge finally got to exhale. But here's the thing. They don't tell you about tyrants when they fall. Everything they held together, even badly, starts to sag. With Linda gone, the HOA basically dissolved into finger-pointing and lawsuits. Property values cratered. People who'd been itching to leave finally took the hit and ran. Good families packed up moving trucks under cover of dawn, just to be done with our troubled little spot by the lake. I watched it all from this same porch. Boots on the railing, coffee in hand, and I started doing math. Houses were cheap. Folks were desperate. The land was still good. The bones of the place were better than the stories people were telling about it. So I did something Linda never expected. I started buying one house, then another. Then the little brick ranch across from the mailboxes. I fixed the roofs, straightened the porches, sanded down the cedar fences folks had let rot, and rented to people who'd had their fill of hard-nosed HOAs. People who just wanted to plant tomatoes without a citation. People who liked wind chimes and porch swings and mailbox colors that didn't come off a committee chart by the time Linda's sentence was winding down. Cedar Ridge didn't look like the place she'd ruled anymore. It looked like a neighborhood, finally remembering how to be one. What she walked back into was a street where half the mailboxes had my last name on the paperwork, and she was the last person to find out. One Tuesday morning, a few days after that first ankle monitor arrest, I watched from my kitchen window as Linda tried to summon her old army. She stood on the sidewalk with her phone. Pacing up and down in front of the house she'd once called the official residence. Her blazer was a little more rumpled, hair not quite as sharp. Still, she talked into that phone like she was drafting troops for a war. "This is Linda Carver, your HOA president," I heard her say. "We need an emergency meeting about a dangerous situation with a non-compliant resident." Calls didn't last long. The more she paced, the smaller she seemed. 10 calls later, she was just a woman standing alone under a street lamp in broad daylight, staring at a phone that had stopped ringing back by midweek. She had a clipboard again and started knocking on doors. Newer families smiled politely and shut the door. Old-timers hid behind curtains instead of answering. She scribbled furious notes, lips moving, eyes darting from deadbolts to porch lights like she was trying to reconstruct an empire from doorknobs. Thursday, she finally noticed something off. I saw her stop dead in front of 42 Maple, squinting at the mailbox. "Mercer," she murmured, loud enough that I heard it across to lawns. Her head jerked up toward my cottage, then back to the name. Her shoulders tightened. Then she saw the one across from it. Different house. Same last name on the deed. You could almost see the gears grinding. Old blueprints colliding with a map that had been redrawn. While she was counting cinder blocks and meal trays, the real crack came when she tried to storm one of my places. Michael, the guy renting 47 Maple, called me mid-morning, voice shaking somewhere between scared and confused. "John, there's some woman in a blazer on my porch," he said. "She says she's from an HOA and wants to see my lease. Did I miss a memo or something?" Through my front window, I could see her, hands flying as she lectured him about regulated fonts on mailbox, names and proper identification. Standards. Michael looked like a man who'd ordered A Quiet Life and gotten live theater by mistake. Then, true to form, Linda pushed past him into the house. That was her move. When the world didn't match the rulebook in her head, she forced herself into the space until it did. I walked over, slow and steady, boots scuffing the pavement inside. She was at his table, flipping through his lease like she was an auditor from a world that only existed in her imagination. "Aha," she said, waving the papers. I knew it. "This whole street is full of Mercer plants." "Linda," I said, voice low, reaching into my pocket. "Step away from my tenant's paperwork." She froze on the word tenant. Her eyes went from the lease, to me, to the house around her. I slid my key into Michael's lock and turned it with an easy click. Her jaw actually dropped. "Your tenant?" she repeated. That's when Jennifer walked in. Our property manager since the HOA finally died on paper. Tablet in hand, calm as a lake at dawn. "Miss Carver," she said, "all business. You're trespassing on property owned by John Mercer. According to county records, he owns this house and 22 others in Cedar Ridge. That makes him the majority owner in this community." For the first time since I'd known her, Linda didn't have words. Her face cycled through half a dozen colors like a stoplight stuck between signals. She looked out the front window, really looked, at the row of houses she'd once bossed around, houses she didn't control, homes she didn't even own. She didn't accept reality. Of course, people like her rarely do. The next few days, she walked the sidewalks like a street preacher, waving papers, talking about forged deeds and fake tenants. She told anyone who'd listen that I'd built a whole artificial neighborhood just to push her out. The deeper truth that Cedar Ridge worked better without a petty dictator sat right in front of her, and she couldn't see it. By the weekend, she'd turned her fantasy into a mission. She showed up in the little park by the lake with a folding table, portable speaker, and a stack of documents thick enough to look official to someone squinting from 50 yards away. "Attention Cedar Ridge residents." Her voice blared through the small amp, bouncing off the siding and the water. "This is an emergency community meeting to expose the illegal seizure of your homeowners association." Folks came out, but not the way they used to. No one brought notepads. They brought lawn chairs, phones, popcorn. Mrs. Patterson set up her camp chair in full sun and crossed her legs like she was settling in for a show. My tenant stood in a loose half circle, arms folded, trading quiet comments. I waited until Linda got warmed up, until she started holding up papers and shouting about how the HOA had never legally been dissolved, how I was a fraud, how every deed with my name on it was invalid. Then I walked into the grass with my own case. A little projector, a laptop, a folder I'd been keeping for just this moment. "Linda," I said loud enough to carry even without a mic. "If you've got the truth in your paperwork, you won't mind if we all look at the whole story." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't stop me. She believed in documents for other people. I clipped a sheet to the projector, fired it up, and there, on the makeshift screen of a white vinyl fence, appeared a familiar signature, hers, on official dissolution paperwork for Cedar Ridge Estates Community Association, filed 4 years earlier. "This," I said, pointing, "is your name, right there. Under President. Filed with the state when your own attorney advised ending the HOA to avoid personal liability." The crowd leaned in. Phones angled up. The wind fluttered the edge of the projection like it was trying to peel her name off the page. Linda stared at the screen like it was some kind of witchcraft. "I never signed that," she muttered, even as her eyes flicked over the date, the letterhead. The attorney note she'd forgotten she'd ever seen. Her hands started to shake. The folder she'd brought slipped and scattered. Papers skating across the grass. Someone in the back, Maria, I think, called out. "So we've been free of her for 4 years and just didn't know it?" A nervous laugh ran through the crowd. Linda's composure finally cracked. "No," she screamed, microphone squealing. "The HOA has to exist. I am the president. You people need rules. You need me." She lunged for the projector ankle monitor, wailing as she crossed whatever invisible line. The court had drawn for her. 2 deputies appeared at the edge of the park like they'd been waiting. Maybe they had. The shriek of the monitor had become their doorbell. She turned on them, still shouting about conspiracies and forged paperwork, pointing at me like I'd forged time itself. They cuffed her on the grass. In front of everyone she'd ever threatened with a letterhead. I didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The documents with her signature were still glowing on the fence. Behind her, like a verdict from a higher court, a few days later. My attorney, Mark, forwarded me the judge's order. Violation of supervised release. New charges for resisting. And a note about her total lack of remorse and her obsession with power over neighbors who wanted nothing to do with her. They didn't just send her back, they banned her. For life from serving on any HOA board, anywhere in the country, for someone like Linda, that might as well have been exile. Cedar Ridge didn't throw a party. There were no banners, no fireworks. Just a slow, deep kind of relief that rolled through the streets like a breeze off the lake. Kids started leaving bikes in yards again without their parents panicking. Garden beds exploded in colors that never would have passed her precious approved palate. We held one brief meeting, not an HOA meeting, just neighbors in the park. Jennifer read out a simple 1-page statement. No association. Normal town laws. Maintain your place. Don't be a jerk. Talk to your neighbor before you call anyone else. That was it. For the first time, we were just a neighborhood. I walked home that evening past the little plaque we'd put up near the playground. Cedar Ridge, founded 1989, freed 2021. Kept peaceful by the people who live here. I stepped back onto my porch, my father's flag moving lazily in the warm air, and looked at the cottage Linda had tried so hard to erase. It was still here. So was I, sitting there with that old mug in my hands. I realized something I wish every HOA bully, every petty neighbor, every clipboard tyrant could understand. You can control fear for a while. You can scare people into measuring their grass and repainting their shutters. But you can't control what happens once they stop being afraid of you. You can't own a community you never loved. Real power isn't in writing rules. It's in being the kind of neighbor people trust when there are no rules left. Linda spent 3 years in a concrete box fantasizing about reclaiming a throne she'd already dissolved with her own pen. We spent those same years quietly building something she could never touch. Not a perfect neighborhood, just a real one. If you're dealing with an HOA bully, or a neighbor who thinks a rule book gives them the right to run your life, hear this from a guy who watched one fall twice. Document everything. Stand together. Learn the law better than they do. And never forget that your home is more than a line in their binder. If you want more stories like this, true tales of ordinary, folks standing up to overreaching HOAs, hit like, subscribe, and tell me your zip code in the comments. You never know. The next story might sound a lot like yours.